All right, guys, we are finishing up our day 3 of discussion for my furthest back person. Now, I want to just recap. So, Alex Haley is writing an autobiography on his ancestors, and he had found out through some research that he came from the Kente tribe, and his mom or his grandma used to talk about someone named Kente all the time, and which he didn't know much about him, but he always just heard her say things that were in the native tongue of Mandinka. And so he researched, he met up with some government officials in Gambia, and he is when we left off yesterday, he was on his way to meet the griot, and he arrives in the village and kind of feels self-conscious about meeting real Africans, because they look at him as like a wealthy Black American, so they're not going to just he just feels like he's ashamed that he's never really cared about his ancestors, or even the people that are still stuck in Africa. And so he just feels a sense of guiltiness. And so the griot starts to recite the history. And so he starts to say things like, so and so begot so and so. And this goes on for hours. But all of a sudden, the griot is reciting the history. And as he goes on, the griot says, about the time the king's soldiers came, Kunta went to chop wood to make a drum and was never seen again. And so this is something that his grandmother had talked about, Kunta. And so it says in the story, goose pimples the size of lemons. Now, this is comparing two unlike things, but it's not using like or as. So this is a metaphor. Goose pimples like lemons popped up over his body. He says, hold up. What did you say? And so he then pulls out a notebook and shows the interpreter that his grandma had told him the story as a child. And the interpreter then tells the griot. The griot then tells the people, who then tells Alex. Who then surround Alex. So the griot tells the people something in his tongue, and then all of the people surround Alex. And then the people go crazy. They want him to hold their babies, take pictures with him, pray over him, a special prayer of thanks for returning Kunta Kinte. And so he doesn't really understand what's going on. But they finally, he starts to realize that these people are putting two and two together, that he is an ancestor of Kunta Kinte. And so finally, they let Alex leave the village, but as they traveled upriver, somehow word had traveled fast, and they were bombarded with people from different villages. These people had heard the news and were yelling, Mr. Kinte, Mr. Kinte. Alex finally loses it. He cannot help but cry over the fact that his ancestors were kidnapped, beaten, and turned into slaves. And ultimately, in conclusion, Alex goes back home and writes his autobiography called Roots. Some of you may have seen the show or the old movie, or you may have seen the show on the History Channel. This story had to be shared. Not only did he write a book, but he also turned that book into a movie. And so, ultimately, the story of Kunta Kinte, some of you may be confused, like, what's the big deal about this guy? Ultimately, this was a person in, Kunta Kinte was a person in this tribe in Africa who was out chopping wood, and he was kidnapped and taken as a slave. And as he was, beaten and taken as a slave and just treated poorly in America, his slave owner had this big ordeal. There were just stories about him, that the slave owner tried to get him, or started calling him Toby, and tried to get him to change his name, and would not call him by his African name, but gave him an American name. And there's this big scene in Roots where Kunta Kinte is refusing to be called Toby. And so, in the movie, it's really a dramatic scene, and I'm sure honestly it doesn't do the truth justice. But in the scene of the movie, he's trying to get him. He's chained to a whipping post and trying to get him as a slave in front of all the other slaves to comply and say his real or his new name. But Kunta Kinte keeps saying, "My name is Kunta Kinte," like he will not let go of his heritage, which is so, so powerful. And so super awesome show and super awesome story. And it is a real story. And so if I was with you guys, I would ask you what the most impactful part about this story has been. This is a different story. This story kind of makes us a little sad, maybe a little angry, maybe a little disappointed, and maybe just leaves us with this nasty feeling like we don't really know how to feel, because slavery is absolutely horrible. But it was absolutely a real part of our American history. And so, anyways, we are going to, I'm actually going to go to the next slide. I'm not even going to worry with this, but I'm going to go to this next slide because when I come back, I'm not going to have the sub do this with you, but when I come back, we are actually going to make a kente cloth with out of paper. So this is going to be a really fun project that we're going to do next week when we come back. But it's going to be really fun. So I'm going to post these videos on Google Classroom for you to kind of go back through. But I definitely want you guys to really be thinking about what colors you would put on your kente cloth. So red represents passion, bloodshed, and death. Purple represents femininity and healing. Green represents planting and growth. Gold represents royalty and wealth. Black represents maturity and strength. Blue represents peace and harmony. And white represents purity and healing. And we are going to talk about these things in depth when I come back. But I don't want you to do them without me because I really want to talk about this. All right, guys, I hope that you are being nice to your sub and you need to do your quick review. Do it now. See you later.